believe. And then, of course, since we're going to do a little bit of recap of last week, because there's some important points that I want to make. So, welcome everybody. And I'm going to be trying to leave this up so that I can get these. I'm going to make sure it says it's still recording. So, hang on just a second.
Yeah, it does here.
It does say it's recording.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Then I guess I'll trust you. If you say it's recording, that works for me. So, all right. Here we go. So, we have reached the final talk on the idea of recapping how we got to the American century. And we're going to go over a few items because we need to make sure we know what we're talking about when we just say American century. What is that exactly? But before we start on that, can you tell me one thing you learned about last week? And one of those items was the fact that post World War I, we saw democracies failing repeatedly. Most fell to dictatorships, some to communism, and of course, in the case of the USSR, really a communistic dictatorship. We had saw that I had said in history it was always laid, the blame was always laid on the concept that World War II will happen because of the missteps of the Paris 1919 treaty that essentially put everything off to the very end, and then instead of being an armistice, actually turned out to blame Russia for everything, or excuse me, Germany for everything, and then take away property, take away territory, saddle them with huge reparations, and yet they'd taken away some of the areas that were their most profitable and best producing regions to give them back to France or give them to others. So that's always, history has always said, well, that's how come we ended up with another war, and that's partially right. But what I do want to point out is, why did we have such a wave of dictatorships come up? And if you look at this map, we can see all of these places that are under right-wing dictatorships essentially by the end of 1939. So, looking at that, I'm going to take a quick look here as we go forward. I want to remind you that I told you that when all those monarchies got swept away, we had a lot of hope for democratic governments. Most of them picked democratic governments because they wanted to emulate what they saw as the success of America. We had always had that concept, mixing our religion with our government. We had always had that concept that we should be that city on the hill. And we always talked about how wonderful democracy is. But one of the things that's happening is, as troubles come up, we suddenly are falling, these other democracies, unlike America, are falling into dictatorships. And the point I've made all along is, after World War I, all of those societies were damaged by that war. I had said that the first victim of World War I was the belief in ideals, especially among the victors, that what they got out of victory really didn't feel like a victory to them. And they had lost the ideals of honor and the belief that you were fighting for something. That resulting, disillusion with all of this and the entire brutality that the war had brought to everybody that was even remotely connected to it, deadened all of these people to concern for others. And remember, if you're talking about a democracy, consider what that really is. You're getting together to talk out the issues and to say, well, I need this for this to work for me. How can we make that it's a win-win situation? How can we make it that you get something out of this as well. And what had actually happened in the aftermath of the war is that doesn't exist. The brutality of the war had deadened concern for others, and with no ideals left, it made democracy very hard to work. And remember, a lot of the democracies that these folks went with were not the balance of powers that we necessarily see in America, which ended up having both a House and a Senate. A lot of times they were a legislative body, and that legislative body could see who would vote for a they were a parliament essentially, and they would come together to vote and say, well, this will be our leader. But then if you lost faith in that leader, your your party, your government fell, and somebody else had to put together another coalition of people. This is not a recipe for a good democracy, in the fact that people are so inured to caring about anybody else. But then we add the other piece that by the end of the 1920s comes in, and that's a financial crisis where Wall Street completely melts down after really an unrealistic bubble that had been going on for quite some time. So we added all that. Now, remember the other point that I'd made, that I think this is a very important point. Everyone that experienced World War I had a somewhat different experience, although they could be shared by their nature. All of those names in yellow are people that were in World War I, but they were in the battles, they were in the field. Most of them perhaps a rank of captain on down. So Maginot, Mussolini, Hitler, de Gaulle, Truman all experienced World War I, and all except Truman had been wounded in battle. Mussolini and Maginot, excuse me, not Mussolini, de Gaulle and Maginot were both wounded at Verdun, which is really the epitome of a war without concern for the combatants, a battle where all you're really trying to do is score bodies. And of course, all of us are old enough to remember when America fell into that trap in Vietnam, where it wasn't about battles that might be strategic in helping you achieve your aims. They were all about just getting a body count, and then we can say we won. And everybody involved knowing they hadn't won anything. But as I said, the two Frenchmen were both wounded in that battle, which really goes to show how fruitless, when you're laying back there and recuperating, you can see the massive numbers of deaths, the massive numbers of injuries, and see just how fruitless those battles were. Hitler would be gassed by the British using mustard gas, retaliating for the gas that the events we talked about in Operation Michael, where the Germans had set that all loose. But in this case, it's Hitler that would be gassed by that. And one of the problems is that Hitler was really not a very successful person at all. He really, remember, he's an Austrian. He really isn't a German. In coming to Germany, he certainly is a second class citizen to all of them. Really and truly, in that war was the only place he felt that he had excelled, that he had exceeded what was possible for him. Mussolini would be wounded as well, but Mussolini was wounded by a a misfiring mortar. In other words, their own armaments would cause him his wound and thus push him out of the battles as well. All of these people are having the experience of what it's like to be on the battlefield, and also what it's like not to realize you have no merit whatsoever, that you could have been one of the dead you were one of the injured. Truman was not injured, and for Truman, World War I was not the defining experience for him, but it did prove to him that he did have leadership qualities. The men that served under him were very satisfied with having him as their boss. But these other names on here, of course, are big names. The one that's not, we'll start with that, is Stalin. And the key point for Stalin, well, where was Stalin in World War I? Stalin wasn't there because Stalin had gotten exiled from Russia for trying to, uh, first for criticizing Russia, the Russian government, Nicholas II, and also for trying to promote communism. He was sent to Siberia. He set out the war in Siberia. Lenin actually had been exiled before that as well. He was in Germany, and one of the last acts before the fall of Russia was the Germans put Lenin in a sealed railway car and sent him back across so that he could be, uh, you know, doing exactly what he ended up doing, which was trying to create a revolution, which worked for them. Didn't do much for Russia, but then again, if you were a serf in Russia, you can't say that was much either. Marshall, George Marshall, somebody that Truman felt was really one of the greatest Americans to ever live, who would end up being a very important part later in our story. Marshall had uh, been attached to the American Expeditionary Force. He would actually go in as a leader, but when they realized his expertise in the logistics, which is of course vital for any battle, the army has to have their supplies or they're not going to be able to battle. Marshall would be pulled upstairs and would actually end up being in charge of logistics for the entire American Expeditionary Force in Europe. Churchill, best related, he was one of the young lions and the up and comers in the political scene, and it had been his step to say that they should, in World War I, invade Turkey. So, of course, that turned out to be a total fiasco, and Churchill really got pushed aside due to a lot of that. Chamberlain and FDR, both in government, both experiencing it that way and seeing the other side of war, what you have to do to make it work. But all of these men all took a different experience back from this war. And all of these men, that experience would be put to work. And we're going to see that later in these talks. Remember, I'd said in the aftermath of war, that there was a lot of upheaval going on in these countries. We'll take Italy, for example. The workers everywhere were calling for strikes. Truth is, in every country, the workers were calling for strikes. How come? Because during the war, think about this, during the war, every one of those industries was making good money, selling everything they could produce in the way of armaments or materials or supplies or whatever it was, selling that to the government because it was needed by the army. And all of the workers had been told, well, it would be too inflationary if you folks hold us up by definitely demanding that you get all of this, of pay and everything else, then we can't have that. So they were all told, after the war, when things come together, then we'll take care of you. So in other words, think about this. All of the industries are doing very, very well. Yes, there is a fright that, well, if our country doesn't do well, I might be gone. But it is kind of funny to realize that, with the exception of a communist takeover, those businesses seem to go on anyway. Now, the industrialists actually, after the war, feared to take over because they now had that perfect example in Russia with the communist uprising. So these confrontations that are happening, especially in Italy, between the strikers who may be socialists, they might be communist, they might just be dissatisfied workers saying, we should be able to make a living as well. In that circumstance, that kind of condition was unsettling to everybody involved, everybody in Italy. They found those confrontations terrible. Now, remember, you're having street demonstrations by workers. There's violence on the strike sites. We've never seen that, right? Angry rhetoric about how Italy had been cheated at the peace conference, confrontations at speeches. Mussolini thrived on these confrontations. He thrived on the disorder. By stirring up disorder at a time of chaos, people will always say they want calm. All of you are old enough, I think. Remember back to 1968 and the protests and the riots. And what did we do in America? We turned to the idea, I want a law and order candidate. Make these people stop rioting. I'm not comfortable with this. Even if there's an issue that people have a right to call it out, such as in the case of this. We aren't making enough money. You seem to be getting rich and wealthy on this. Why don't we get paid? Remember as well that if you then try to heckle Mussolini, if you're speaking out against him at one of these talks or against the speaker there, remember all of his black shirts are surrounding them. They're all former stormtroopers or claim to be former stormtroopers. And remember, the stormtroopers are those individuals who were trained to go over the top, not in mass, but to infiltrate the other trench system, and to disrupt that so that the trenches could be cleared as attacks were happening, instead of those massive up and over the tops that were nothing more than cannon fodder for the defenders. The stormtroopers were a very late addition, and you saw them in Italy, you saw them in Germany. But these gang leaders for Mussolini were stormtroopers. So if you heckle him at that speech, the stormtroopers who surround him will come down on you and beat you. And very possibly you could end up killed. And of course, to Mussolini, he would be egging them on and also claiming this is how you subdue the communists, the socialists, because he would, immediately deride these people as that. Now, remember, in the case of Germany, slightly different. Hitler wants to take power, and in doing so, he's using democracy to destroy democracy. Remember, he had tried the same way Mussolini had, to stage a protest, to make it very theatrical and have his troops and everybody back him as he came in. But of course, that really didn't work for Mussolini either. He stage managed everything, stayed off site until he knew it was going to be safe. Hitler, of course, did time in prison because they tried to do it actually. Hitler, in copying Mussolini's tactics, realizes, well, what I've really got here is the beginning of a political party as well. My goal is to get voted in. And he's got one of the largest blocks of people voting, so one could think he would get in there. He doesn't actually make it. But what happens is they step forward, the German government steps forward in a good faith effort saying, you represent all these people, why don't you come in and we'll share power with you. Again, everybody thinking he's a political neophyte or at least a political lightweight. They'll run rings about him, and of course, he's the one that runs rings around them. In doing all of this, his goal is to use democracy to destroy democracy. He would use events to declare a national emergency. In that national emergency, rescind the rights of the people, and they just never get around to getting them back. Big deal. So, what about the US? How is it the US is immune to this? And the truth is, it is not. because we had exactly the same situation. We had wage freezes throughout the entire war. But at the same time, in America, you've got an acceleration of production based on uh, additional technology. We saw that in steel, we saw that in building bigger, newer plants and things like that. And that also, of course, always has a downward pressure on wages. So, come the end of the war, these men are looking to be rewarded, to come up in wages. And when they're not, strikes are breaking out. And that is major in 1919 and 1920 in America. Mills, mines, are all scenes of strikes. Steel mills in Colorado, Illinois, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, in other words, all across the country, were closed as violence escalated. And that violence, of course, always ends up being workers trying to demand that their jobs be protected while they're striking, and either armed guards or most often local sheriff's offices and deputies, massive, quickly deputized men, will be the ones on the other side, stopping them from blocking that mill. Remember, there is no right to strike in America at this point. Because, of course, remember as well, this is at that point where everybody prior to, and it's still true today. Oh, well, if the Constitution doesn't say exactly that, then it can't be done. And of course, that was the difference with Wilson. When Wilson had come along, Wilson had said, the document, the Constitution is a living document, and being a living document, we can't expect it to know about things that would have happened long before, long after the founding fathers. How could they even have imagined this? So we have to rely on their intent, as well. What were they trying to do? And they're saying, well, they were trying to balance power. They were trying to ensure that individuals have rights. Because remember, what is, a lot of all this entire discussion for 2.5 weeks now, coming up, the full three, has all been about what is government's job. And remember, you look at the Constitution, it will tell you it's to protect the things you own, your property, and your rights. That you have certain rights that cannot be taken away from you just because a government doesn't like how you talk, that can't be taken away from you just because you have a different skin color. Well, of course, that has taken over 200 years for America to try to rectify that second part. But the goal in America has always been to be a classless society. In other words, no barriers. You can move from the very bottom to the very top based on the sweat of your brow. Doesn't always work out like that. And these strikes are one example of that, because for all the non-laborers that are seeing the wave of strikes in 1919 and 1920 and hearing all the rhetoric and the shouting and everything else and the demands that they should be paid and wages, all those non-laborers are fearful of immigrants because they've been labeled terrorists. And because of the rise of socialism and communism in Russia, they see only what we see in this picture, that a strike is really communists trying to take control. And thus, with that, what you're really saying is free speech is under attack as well. And remember, this gets hard because we saw there was a bombing on Wall Street in 1920, that really were by terrorists who probably were um, immigrants. So it's very, very difficult, to see the right way forward. But I said, why is America immune? Well, obviously it's not immune, but there's kind of a safety valve. And in 1920, as all these things are happening, and you've got things going on like suddenly a police strike. Well, wait a minute, the police strike, who's here to protect us? Um, you've got all of these things happening in 1920. People are uneasy and they want that law and order candidate. And what you end up with is the Harding administration, which backs business in any form. And their goal, as I said last week, is the rollback of all the progressive regulations pushed by Wilson. And that means the progressive income tax. They can't get rid of income tax because it had been put in as a amendment to the Constitution. So they can't get rid of it. What they can get rid of is the way the law was written, which is the progressive side of it, which means the more money you make, the more taxes you pay. Even from the very beginning, that was never popular. And we still are facing that today, right? Oh, you can't tax the rich, you got to give them tax incentives and tax decreases to get them to invest their money in government or in the country, in the business in this country. So the progressive income taxes, the 8-hour workday, both are quickly dumped. High tariffs then return because remember, if we don't get it from income tax, how did we always support the country? It was always supported by tariffs, and the higher the better was the feeling. Well, that's true if you're not somebody trying to sell your product back across the pond and people retaliate saying, well, we have to pay this kind of a tariff, we're going to make you pay this kind. And plus, they put in immigration restrictions, as we talked about last time. Remember, the other reason, my point being that safety valve, where you have an election, the government steps aside and you bring in another government to say, well, let's try it this way. But remember, America had faced these same problems from the 1880s on. As the Industrial Revolution came on, businesses got bigger, and they were entities that were rich men in control of ever larger organizations. And then they found the magic ticket, which is they created agreements from each other, calling them trusts or conglomerates, and thus made sweetheart deals with each other and froze out anybody that might be competing with them. They're trying for a monopoly. They're trying to jack up their income to the largest amount they can. And these businesses, of course, are in total control. They decide the hours worked by a person, how much you're going to pay them, and what days they're working. Because remember, we're getting rid of that idea that, oh, if you go over 8 hours, you get overtime. That's crazy talk. What are you thinking? Really, remember the big thing about a business, just who could work, i.e., who is going to get a reward, is controlled by that business. My point being, though, America had figured out how to get around some of this. And we talked about that a little bit. And, it's much like your body. When you've had an illness, and if you're by an infection and your body learns how to fight it off, that same thing is true for later on, right? And remember, these businesses prior to Teddy Roosevelt and then later Wilson, these businesses largely controlled the legislature, even if they don't completely control it, which they did. They controlled the agenda. Thus, all laws that affected businesses could be sidetracked. There is no independent oversight of businesses because it's not in the Constitution. There's no independent agencies that are safe from political control because that's not in the Constitution. That's what the folks that are saying, no, we got to go with just what's written. Remember, business was in control, and they were always in control locally via that authority over who has a job, who's going to get paid, and who's going to pay the price. But as I said, Roosevelt's the first to challenge that, and he did that when a huge coal trust refused to negotiate with workers. And when the workers struck and the coal could not be mined, coming into winter, the lack of coal suddenly became a huge issue. Roosevelt demanded that they negotiate to reach an agreement. The coal mine owners had absolutely no interest in reaching agreement. They wanted to tell the workers, this is what you'll be paid and nothing more. And we don't care and we don't like you anyway. And besides, you live in a company town, you already owe me everything because I'm charging you for your housing. I'm charging you for your food. I'm charging you for everything. And it's at an exorbitant rate. TR would demand that they reach an agreement. When he was rebuffed the first time, he demands they reach an agreement, uses public opinion to follow him, and in making that says you will negotiate and you will have binding arbitration. And of course, the coal owners realized that was a killer for them because everybody's going to look at these folks and realize they make nothing. So Teddy Roosevelt steps up as that first change, recognizing that the average person cannot stand up to big business and places the power of the federal government on the side of the public as a balance. So he's not always going to be just on the side of the public, but he saw the need for government to try to rein in these massive businesses that nobody in the revolutionary America at the time of the Constitution could ever have dreamed could exist. And following him, Wilson takes it one step farther, where Teddy Roosevelt had gotten had made progress on trying to break up trusts. Wilson's efforts are always through the legislature, and he makes it work as law. So it's not by edict, as we saw with Mussolini. It's not by presidential order, as so many try. It's a constitutional law or a constitutional amendment. So something to think about with this until the 1980s. When you studied American presidencies, Wilson was considered a heroic, almost godlike president, that he had laid the groundwork for FDR. And it's because he had passed a progressive agenda. And remember, progressive meant for the people in concept. He's also the first president who's really working as a legislative leader, leading the House and the Senate in the direction he wants to go. And he passed incredible laws, tariff reforms, the Revenue Act that created the progressive income tax out of the new income tax legislated by the amendment. A Federal Reserve Act, a Federal Trade Commission, all of these groups, the Clayton Antitrust Act, they deal in regulation, not lawsuits. They just want to create regulations. Everybody can work at on the same field. They all have a chance. The big point being, though, you realize this Federal Reserve Act, Federal Trade Commission, they realize that one party or the other would like to have that. So they basically built in the concept that whoever is appointing, whoever's in charge, every one of these boards will be a bipartisan commission. And they'll make it an odd number, but thus you will have 8 Democrats and 8 Republicans, but you'd actually have a ninth one that whoever's actually in charge at this point gets to perhaps come up with that person. And as I said, the Federal Trade Commission follows that. Later on, another 20 years, we're going to see the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. All of these commissions deal with that situation. They do not want them to be used as a partisan method. They are meant to work with and help everybody. He also worked with the agriculture. He worked with trying to cut the hours in the laborers' lives, get increased pay, help create that 8-hour workday, and child labor, which had increasingly been knocked down many times, by different judges as being, no, no, we can't touch that because it doesn't say that in the Constitution. But the interesting thing is, Wilson had used democracy, not a stroke of a pen, not a statement. Yet today, both sides disavow him. Conservatives, because he'd curbed the unbridled business culture that had been going on with that industrial revolution, that with as the point where all those businesses are becoming huge, he's the one that said the Constitution is a living document. You have to understand what they're trying to achieve. But the Democrats have no use for him anymore either because of his biases. It is clear as you look back how the biases he had, whether you want to call it racism, he segregated the civil service. In other words, he embraced that separate but equal. He embraced all those pieces because he too was not interested in being president of everyone, just the people that maybe looked like him. So that has made him problematic. But by 1932, the roaring 20s were just a bitter memory. And after 3 years of depression, because I said we had that crisis come along with 25% or more unemployed and the government doing nothing, many now have gotten to the point where any community chest, any religious or independent organizations, that money has been used. There is nothing left. People have lost their houses. A lot of men went on the road, A, trying to look for a job, but B, also the fact that staying home and realizing you were failing and failing your family clearly had a part of them leaving too. One of the things that did happen was a bonus army appeared, and that bonus army would march on Washington because they had been told after World War I they would get their bonus, they'd get their pension. And what they're saying is, we are desperate now, pay us, or at least pay us part of it so that we have something so we can survive. In 1932, as confrontations are happening around the country and escalating, there's one in Washington, D.C., when the 8,000 bonus army men are routed from their Hooverville tents, and all of them are put, all of the tents and their possessions are put to the torch. It is the U.S. Army being led by General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur will lead them into this battle, and he, of course, would say that he's directed by the president. Hoover would not disavow it, but would not agree on that. That it was not what he had asked for, but it's just one of the early cases of MacArthur exceeding his authority and his orders. And of course, being MacArthur, does what he thinks is best. The vets asking for what they were owed, not asking for something else. So we see rising confrontations. At the same time, we see others that are rising using the newfound media of the time to get followers. Father Coughlin, who was a priest, Catholic priest, would use radio, and he built a following by promising social justice, because that's all anybody wants, justice, right? Well, this is social justice. You should get what you want, what you need, what you are owed. But part of the problem is, you know, he continues to go further and further, and in the process, his idea of social justice mirrors very much the same interests that the Nazis have in their anti Semitic beliefs. Father Coughlin is absolutely positive that the Jews are the root of all evil in America, specifically their control of the banking system, that is why the country fell. In other words, he has his version of the big lie as well, right? Huey Long is coming up. Huey Long, governor of Louisiana, he'd go on to be a senator, had promised handouts to the poor. He called it the share the wealth plan. And where did he get this wealth? Well, he determined that it's Louisiana and you, the oil companies, are drilling in our tidewater. Well, he gets a law passed that says the state controls the offshore land as well, out past their borders, and thus the state should get a share of the money. And there are a number of businesses who will cave in rather than find that their entire company has been locked out or taken control of or anything else. Not that we haven't heard any of this. You may have just read a news story that Louisiana is at this concept again. Of course, it's not all that different than a lot of other things that we saw earlier this year, where businesses were being told they had to pay this or come up with this. And rather than fight it in lengthy court battles, they just acquiesced, knowing that they had the money. But that share the wealth plan was really popular because, of course, he's just saying, oh, I'm going to send every citizen a check, not for doing anything, just a check. And of course, at this time, in the late 1920s, early 30s, that's just unbelievable. Nobody thinks that should happen. Well, that would be communism. I remember as well another group that is having a terrible time. Their Great Depression started in 1920 as the demand for all of the produce they had been growing dropped after the first year past the Great War. The farmers end up completely undercut and their prices go into the ditch. They were already, the 1920 prices had never been equaled, and the 29 prices before the crash were already terrible. So while the rest of the country had been enjoying the roaring 20s, the American farmers saw their income totally disappear, but it got much worse in the Depression. Crop prices by 1932 were less than a third of what they were in 1920. 1929, $1.03 a bushel for wheat, 36 cents a bushel, for 3 years later. Hogs selling for 11.36 a head, they're at half. 1931, 6% of Iowa farms changed ownership due to bankruptcy. In 1932, that would be 8%. These are terrible numbers. And in doing so, come August of 32, the farmers rise up. They have a farm strike. They have decided they can't do this anymore. They've come up with the idea, well, if we could restrict goods being sold, we could force the price up. And what they kept talking about is we just want to make as much as it costs us to plant and tend to these and harvest them. So they declare the farmers' holiday because, as I said, 6% of Iowa farms, but really it's 6% of all farms in Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, changing ownership due to bankruptcy or foreclosure. Why? Because remember, in 1919 and 1918, when their produce is selling incredibly well, they want to make more money. And the way to do that is to have more acres tilled. And to do that, you got to buy the acres. And you either now owe taxes on all that land if you were lucky enough to have the money to buy it outright. But most people did not. They bought it, on credit. And now foreclosures are happening. So by August, we are seeing that farm strike. And those farmers are blocking all the roads leading to the markets in Sioux City. They want to reduce supplies to raise prices. Telephone poles knocked down, riddled with nails, thrown in front of trucks that won't stop. The milk strike happens, and this picture is them dumping milk. That only happened the first time because they realized, the problem is the farmers are bringing the milk into town. The milk's going to go bad no matter what. If they can't sell it, it is going to go bad. It's going to be dumped, but this just looks terrible where they're dumping good raw milk. People, what they do is they change their mind, and from this point on, for the next 2 weeks during the farm strike, that milk will be taken into orphanages, to schools, to all of the other places, trying to give that milk to them instead. It just gets worse. By that strike will go away. It will be quelled because much of it had happened as the milk producers were having a fight with Robert's Dairy, as Robert's Dairy was declaring they were going to cut what they were paying. And instead, the farmers are saying, no, you're going to pay more. And they actually do end up paying a little more. So while things, as harvest time comes and the farmers go back to their fields because they have to harvest and the winter comes in, so by 1933, we've had the election in 32. By 1933, but before the new officers take power from the election in 32, now it's 40% of all farms have taxes delinquent, and the auctions are leading to conflict and an uprising. And you would see a judge pulled out of his courtroom, threatened with hanging, humiliated publicly. He would never say who it was, and probably the only thing that saved his life is the crowd was working itself up into a frenzy to actually possibly hang him. The editor of the Lamar's Daily Sentinel says, this is not going to go well for you. This is not going to answer your needs. You've made your point. Use that, step away now. And they actually listened. And the judge would never say who it was. Even if he recognized the men, he would not name them. But with that, the lid is off. There are many of these problems going on, especially around Northwest Iowa. And the problem is, if Northwest Iowa, the most rock-ribbed conservative people on this earth, are now talking about, maybe it's time for another American Revolution, things are bad. The Iowa National Guard will be called in. Martial law will be declared in 3 different counties. It is unrest. And into all of that, you have a new president taking power. He, after the 3.5 years of nothing being done, nothing being tried, just being told to stay the course, Hoover's voted out a new guy who had actually dealt with this in New York State for the past 3 years and doing some interesting things, would be elected. His name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He recognized that people needed to see results. We need action and action now, and went about figuring out how to do that. Huge projects for public works. He actually gets money allocated for that. But how do you make it happen? He turns to an Iowa-born Harry Hopkins, who had attended Iowa's Grinnell College, had worked at Hull House in Chicago, who had worked for Roosevelt in the New York state government on these issues. And he tells Roosevelt, I can put 4 million people to work if he just has the money. And within 2 weeks of opening the Civil Works program, which will morph into the Public Works program, or the Works Progress Administration, within 2 weeks, he has 1 million people signed on, and on that first paycheck, 800,000 will get paid. Now, that might only have been a quarter per day, but it was money. It was real money that could be spent. And 2.6 million are employed. And what are they doing when they're employed? Whatever it is that needs to be done in these public works programs. So, in other words, you might be working on creating that new channel that they're building to go through the stockyards. You might be working on taking down improving a road, and that might mean you need to take down the side of a Luss Hill to get that road built. And it's men in all these cases, it's men wearing the clothes that they showed up in, with shovels and rakes. That's what they can be given. That's what they can get. Now, FDR adds another one, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which will focus on young men who will be brought together and they will work them, but they will also work on their health. In other words, there will be calisthenics, there will be, exercise and everything else because they've got heavy work to do, in planting trees or clearing brush or whatever it is they're doing. The difference with this one is they might be paid $25. They're going to get $5 of that per month. The rest of the money is going to be sent home to their parents, to their families, so that they can survive. Because these young men have barracks, have a place to live, have the things they need. All of this goes back to who controls the economy. That becomes the biggest issue. Think about it when you talk about communism rising, socialism rising, you are saying, those people are saying we need to control the economy. And as I said, in America, we had that safety valve of, well, let's change to another player. Let's see if we can make something happen this way. And the thing is, Roosevelt's efforts actually make a difference. People do start to have a little money, just enough to eat. They're not getting rich or anything else. They have to do a day's work to get that money. And by the 1940s, the National Association of Manufacturers would write that the American public blames business practices and their unfair efforts at unseemly gain as the reason for the Great Depression. Never again, they say, will the public trust business as the proper controller of the economy as opposed to the government. Now, of course, they're saying that's a bad thing, and it might be a bad thing. Point being, though, that they are making something happen. They're changing it. And for the perfect example, most importantly, FDR repeatedly led Americans away from those dangerous shoals of the far left, where the Huey Longs, the Coughlins, the Townsends were leading people saying, you deserve free money. You deserve to have your government pay you. And while Roosevelt's election in 32 had been incredible with a 60% election, he would get far more than that and lose only one state in 36, and that state was Kansas, of course. So, what is the proper role of government? I want you to consider that because these major countries in Europe, one after another, fell to dictatorships. Fell to those dictatorships because that was the aim and the point that those men who had come up, the Hitlers, the Mussolinis, and others, that they were using the tools of democracy or anything else to get to that point, but they would seize power. Yet consider, even when people are offering that power to FDR, like George Washington, he avoided grasping that which was offered. That is a big point. That's not the case in Europe. In the aftermath of total war, the massive loss of life leads to a loss of ideals and trust. And if you have a loss of trust, then why not take the power? And remember, your leaders themselves are pushing that. They are pushing the big lie that it's the business, it is the international bankers, i.e., the Jewish bankers, the financial pieces that are doing all this. They sold you out. Now, here's the other thing to realize, though. As I've said a couple of times, Hitler was always underestimated. Nobody really believed he would go that far, that he could do these things. And of course, all of the things he had been preaching, were coming from him. And remember, I said that Hitler and FDR came to power in 33 within weeks of each other. And a 1933 American article in a Portland news magazine would reassure it was a Hitler expert would reassure the readers that, quote, Hitler and his Nazis must ride the middle course, unquote, and won't be able to carry out the extremist policies that have been advocated in the Nazi party platforms. Well, who is wrong on that one? So we have seen how all of this is coming to be. We have seen how it's all happening. And we are coming to a new world as we've gone through these upheavals. But we have new leaders that have taken the stage that will be looking at what can be done. And we are looking at the idea of what differences launch World War II as opposed to World War I, what changes during the war, and why is there a different result after this war? These are big questions and big points. And I'm going to be asking you again, what defines the American century, and did we achieve that? In 1931, Japan will invade Manchuria. So, in the middle of all this hubbub, when you are creating dictatorships, when you are creating empires, then the idea is you, of course, are going to go conquer other places to create that empire. And an empire may bring you wealth, but it may bring you the resources you need to continue expanding your empire. Japan has been building for 20 or more, almost, well, really 30 years. In 31, they swiftly invade Manchuria to add the resources. They'd already taken Taiwan after a dust up with China in 95. They had gotten that foothold in Manchuria, and we're going to talk about that during their battle with Russia. And they'd gotten to hold on to the Manchuria Railroad, essentially the Siberian Railroad that connected back across the continent. And what they would do is work with that, but realize they already have annexed Korea. They'd been holding it for quite a while, but they finally made it formal in 1910. Um, Japan is determined to be an empire, and a large one at that. Um, the way they got this battle going, it's kind of an important thing to think about. It was the Mukden incident. And what the Mukden incident was that a bomb exploded near the rail yards of this railroad that the Japanese controlled. And thus it was seen, oh my gosh, the railroad is under attack, send in the troops. The reality is that it was the Japanese troops that planted the bomb and then accused others of being the ones to do it, of being the Manchurians who did it, so that they would have a pretense, a reason to invade, and they do so. That's called a false flag event, where you are accusing, you say you have evidence that the people who followed this were followers of X, were followers of somebody, were, the communists, the liberals, the conservatives, whatever, the side that's on the other side. And the problem is with this invasion, Japan's treatment of all non-Japanese people is brutal and to the point of death. Japan truly sees what they would call in those days their race as being the superior race to everybody. And if you are not that race, you are really beneath concern. What we see by the end of the decade, though, is Japan is trying to make even more things happen. And they will occupy the northern French Indochina by 1939. The U.S. realizes they're trying to take over the Dutch East Indies for their oil reserves. So the U.S. in turn tries to use you know, controls, they cut off all shipments of aviation fuel, scrap iron, steel to Japan. And they don't do it instantly. They kind of play it out. They're trying to make this work, but they're also trying to, you know, damp down the situation. Japan will go on to occupy Indochina, and they will threaten British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies. And that at that point they're getting too close to an oil source because remember, Teddy Roosevelt set in progress in you know in a set of situations in progress where America, with this big fleet that he created and everything else, was going to be a world power and would be able to project their power out over the oceans, would be able to protect their items. And of course, one of the reasons that we kept the Philippines is to have a coaling station. Well, we've changed from coal to petroleum, but you still have to have a place to get that. So FDR will freeze all Japanese assets in response to that move on British Malaya. And Britain and the Dutch will follow immediately after. And then the U.S. announces a total oil embargo against Japan by August 1st of 1941. Remember, none of this is happening in a vacuum. In 1939, when that first one happened, you've got Hitler and Stalin going together to attack Poland, which really kicks off World War II. Remember, Poland had been created, they'd been brought back from non-existence, after all those years not being a country. They were brought back by the 1919 Paris Peace Accords, and their their ability to live, much like the ability of Manchuria and all these other countries, it's the League of Nations that's going to help them do that. But without America in the League of Nations, you don't have that disinterested outer party, and you don't have the resources that America could put into it. Poland will fall in a month. And right behind that, it's like dominoes. You've got 1940 May, because of course, by attacking Poland, that kicks in the treaty that France has with Poland, and boom, just like we saw with World War One, it's that treaty at that time, that it also occurred with France, and in attacking, immediately the unheard of will happen. France falls in a lightning war, and it's all because the Germans have come up with a new tactic in how to use this armor that has progressed since World War One to be a lot better tanks, but they're still pretty thin. They're pretty small. But how those tanks, or maybe armored half tracks that can transport troops faster, and the air, all of these planes, we're no longer talking about biplanes and Zeppelins. We're talking about much more sophisticated, much more speedy airplanes with mounted weapons and the ability to drop bombs. And in that lightning war, they will attack France. Everybody was shocked at how fast Poland fell, but France, which was not a lightweight, which was not, was considered one of the top military organizations, would be knocked out in 6 weeks. Paris would fall. They would surrender to the Germans. And immediately the Germans would just switch over. They had dealt a backhanded blow to the British expeditionary force that had come over to support France. They'd just knocked them out of the way. And really, if they had paid more attention to them, they could have ended up capturing the entire group. As it was, since they wanted to make sure they got Paris, it gave the British time to have, the boat lift that will get them back off the continent. Into all this, FDR realizes that there is no way that London will stand, a constant bombardment. And Churchill, who's stepped back into power, will actually contact Roosevelt, and Roosevelt, whose hands are tied by the Neutrality Act, because while the American public might be reconsidering as to whether or not they want to be involved, Congress is not. We're going to talk a little bit about how that works. Started 38 because remember, uh, the British had come over and had said there will be peace in our time. It's Chamberlain's magic moment because what was going on? Another one of those created countries, Czechoslovakia, had included an area that was called the Sudetenland, which had a lot of Germans living there. You know, Hitler just demands that those people need to be freed from the Czechs. And that's all he wants. He just wants the Sudetenland. That's all it's going to take. And of course, they attack. They did another one of those false flag situations, saying that, oh, the Germans there are being mistreated, that are living in Sudetenland, and thus they attack. The Czechs, under the agreement that had created Czechoslovakia, turns to the British, turns to the French, and of course the British. Chamberlain comes over, speaks to Hitler, and Hitler tells him, "Oh, we just want the Sudetenland," and that's what leads to that pronouncement of peace in our time. Yet the ink was hardly dry. Hitler had gone in, took the Sudetenland, and took anything else he wanted, as forcing the Czech surrender. Bottom line, that was the first instance where people really saw what was happening with Hitler. And it was that instance where appeasement was recognized that it wasn't going to work. And it's at that moment he's made an agreement with the Russians as a non-aggression pact just to keep the Russians off his back. And the Germans will invade Poland and will immediately chop through it. And they're using these new tactics. It's called a blitzkrieg. It's the combination of armor, air, and mechanized infantry. The idea is they blitz through the line. Normally, you go up, you have to fight, and the loser falls back. And they can continue to fall back. They might be losing troops, but they can continue to fall back. The difference is the Germans have figured out with this armor, if their opponent does not have anti-armor or anything that can harm them, they can blitz through the line, then deploy the men out of the half tracks. And now you've got the force in front and the force behind. And when they try to fall back and can't, they surrender, which is a far, you might lose 2% or 3% before your men start running. But now they can't, and thus they surrender. So the first prisoners of the new Auschwitz concentration camp in 1940 were the Polish, and they were not only Poles captured as resistance fighters, but they were also Polish political prisoners to ensure that there would be no further combat after they had captured Poland. What will actually happen is anybody that is caught after this in the countryside and are declared to be resistance fighters, they will be sent to the concentration camps, but they will be executed. But those who actually live, it really doesn't make much difference because they will become slave labor, not treated well, not fed, and worked until they die. I'm going to try and swing past this. So, into all this, as you've had that backhand blow that has made it very clear that, the Nazis now have turned around and pushed aside the British and taken France, in May of 1940, Winston Churchill will replace Neville Chamberlain when it's become obviously clear that appeasement does not work. And Chamberlain says he's got nothing. He has no idea what can be done. It's Winston Churchill, who's been on the outside. As I said, he had originally been one of the young lions, those up and comers, and he'd gotten pushed out for his issues in World War One. The failed idea of attacks. And as prime minister, he knows that appeasement will not work. It will require a confrontation. He starts working on America, trying to get at least the goods he needs, trying to convince them they need to be part of this. But when he talks to his people, he is simply honest and promises nothing but blood, sweat, and tears. But he also demanded and insisted and repeated that Britain would prevail and they would fight the Nazis every step of the way. Of course, the problem is to do so, they've got to have supplies, and they don't have it. In 1940, Germany invades through the Low Countries just as they did in World War One. They do actually do a new trick. They go through the Ardennes forest, which nobody thought could go through, and it was Hitler that pushed that. Hitler and one other German general, and the German generals that opposed him, which many did, found themselves being pushed aside, retired, or in actuality, one of them would go to battle and die in the front lines in mysterious circumstances. Says something. Again, just 6 weeks, they overran Belgium, the Netherlands, drove the British off the continent, captured Paris, forced the surrender of the French government, and in doing so, take possession technically of every bit that the army controls. They set up the Vichy government, who are now collaborators and partners with the Germans. And with France's fall, Hitler invites his friend and mentor, Mussolini, to celebrate and plan the dismemberment of France. Both of these men have done everything that they intended to do in those months coming up. In the 1920s is when they took control, but it's the 1930s that they're exercising their plan. And that next target is a nightly bombing blitzkrieg of London. And remember, in America, it is at that point that we start seeing all of these things, because in America, we now have radios. Unlike World War One, you are there, you can listen in, and you've got broadcasters broadcasting each night in London and telling how the shopkeepers and the people continue to work every day and at night go into the underground to hold out and to come up the next morning, and some of the buildings will be gone, but to not give up. They will not relinquish. They will not give in to Hitler. FDR realizes that something has to be done, but again, America has the Neutrality Act that prevents any direct aid. So by December, he is mentioning the arsenal of democracy in 1940. He presents his vision of the United States using its industrial and agricultural strength to supply the Allied nations who are fighting against the Nazi aggression, to sell them the goods, but it is selling them in a cash and carry situation, that they are turning around and putting that together to help them out and not violate the Neutrality Act. Cash and carry means we will avoid any possibility of a submarine sinking an American ship. Now, that really isn't true. One will actually get sunk. Nobody's ready to make it a big deal yet, but there is some fight. It's the Reuben James. It's a destroyer who is kind of quietly escorting some of the British ships that had bought goods. Excuse me. So Excuse me. With that, FDR is starting to push. While much of America is receptive to that, hearing these broadcasts, seeing what is happening, and remember, a third of Americans are first generation or less away from Europe. They see what's happening. And while much of America is rousing to the dangers, Congress is not. They are determined to be isolationist. But FDR makes sense to Americans hearing his radio talks. He's not saying, let's go to war. He's saying, let's just sell them the goods they need. These are people we know. And Americans who remember 1917, who saw the results of Poland, understand this time they need to be prepared. This may actually come to them. And by 1940, private factories are gearing up to supply anything they can under cash and carry. Now, remember, Wilson had the 14 points that had really made him international in appeal to all of the Europeans in World War One. FDR is much simpler. He comes up with the four freedoms that he says defines Americans' belief: a freedom of speech, a freedom of religion, a freedom from want, and a freedom from fear. He says these are the differences between the United States and the Nazis. They are very powerful because everyone is seeing in the takeover of France what has happened to freedom of speech, what has happened to freedom from fear. Those are definitely gone. Freedom from want, if you are not of a class that the Nazis like, you may just disappear. But no matter what, you may find it hard to have any kind of livelihood. And because of this ongoing fear, as that war is raging, Congress agrees that we need to actually start preparing and narrowly passes the Selective Training and Service Act. It is the first peacetime draft in the United States history. This is a big deal, and it doesn't come any too soon because within just a few months, the Japanese will have a surprise attack on December 7th in Pearl Harbor, an island most Americans could not have located on a map the day before, and that attack will change history. You know, it comes out of the blue. The Japanese wanted us to stop criticizing their bloody war in China and to lift the embargo on oil so that they could continue their quest in fighting the British, fighting everyone else, fighting all the colonial powers that are out there, the Dutch in the East Indies, etc. They had thought the American public would be intimidated by a massive show of force. And remember, it's a huge surprise because technically, as things stood, it was impossible to attack Pearl Harbor. One, how could they even get close enough? Two, even with those bombers dropping torpedoes, no known torpedo could be used in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. But that was not true. The Japanese had used technology in two ways. One, just like us, they'd started using air power with the Navy, with uh, aircraft carriers to project force, not these battleships like the ones that are being blown up there. And they had really intended to catch the American uh, aircraft carriers in or around Pearl. You know, the Japanese attack was a complete success and a massive failure at the same time. You know, they were Japan's greatest mistake. Americans really did not have Japan on their radar. They really did not care. But in doing this with a backstabbing surprise attack, they created an implacable enemy that would never quit, that would only continue to go. And that is part of America. It may be slow to rouse, but once you do, they will go to the extreme. And we're going to see how that works out. Congress, of course, would instantly declare war on Japan with no hesitation when FDR asks. Again, Germany would create their second mistake. They gratuitously declared war on the US, which would lead to their eventual destruction as well. I said it's their second mistake because in June of 1941, Germany had turned on the Soviet Union. That non-aggression pact that they had had with the Soviets, June 22nd, 1941, the entire with really with France subdued and you know Britain reeling and the United States not even dabbling on the horizon, Hitler did what conquerors do. He turned to the next direction, and one of the things, of course, he looked at was, I can do better than Napoleon. I will take Moscow. What that means is overnight, America is in a two-ocean war, that they will have to, fight a war on two totally different theaters with two completely different military forces. But in fact, the US originally will only commit 15% of its resources to the Pacific War. Why? Because US generals had long recognized that Japan, its entire problem, the reason they ended up angry at us was because we were denying them access to the resources they wanted. They needed the gas and oil to be able to attack more places to get the materials they needed. But even if they'd had them, they did not have the productive power of America's industrial base. They knew that the generals knew that Japan could not maintain a prolonged combat with the US. And here we just see massive numbers of bombers, fighter planes, and tanks being pushed out there. And what this would really mean is that Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was coupled with all the other attacks that people had been watching out for. Manila, Singapore, Indochina, all of those were attacked at the same time as Pearl Harbor. Everybody had said, well, which one are they going to attack? Where will they possibly attack? It wasn't where, it was all of them. But in doing so, that is also transcribing. They will take the Dutch East Indies, they will get the resources that they were looking for, the gas and oil. But what this also means, it is at the max of their expansionism. When and remember, the rest of those attacks, the one in the Philippines was also against us, the one in Manila, but most of the others were on Great Britain. Attacked on December 7th along with us, and December 8th. The Dutch East Indies were really the primary objective in all that, because Japan needed the oil to wage their wars. But they already knew that Britain was tied down in Europe, and they saw Americans as likely to pull back. That was their idea. But one of the problems is not only are they fighting the technology of the productivity of American labor and American factories, they are also facing the reality that technology had changed warfare in the ocean. That same technology that had made it possible for them to attack Pearl Harbor, because they had come up with improved planes and improved torpedoes and improved aircraft carriers to get them there unspotted, there will be more and more and more technology advances. One of them will be radar. And what really all of this with radar and aircraft, it completely changes how naval battles will be fought. In the Pacific, there are no naval battles of the old style where the ships hove into view, turn broadsides, and just batter each other. The attacks are taken, are made over the horizon. There are task forces of ships with planes in escort that will be dropping bombs and harassing them. And we will see that almost immediately. By May of 42, you've got Coral Sea, and right after that, you've got Midway. Now, America is not doing as well on land. They are trying to do some, and this will be mostly the Marines that will be fighting in the Pacific. But what we actually have is you will have Midway in June of 1942. And Midway, June, only 7 months after Pearl, Midway actually, that battle will avenge Pearl Harbor. Radar is the key to setting the trap. Midway cost the Imperial Japanese Navy the sinking of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. More importantly, killing hundreds of experienced pilots. They effectively completely halt Japan's ability for an offensive expansion in the Pacific. They can still fight on land, but this is a critical turning point because it forces Japan to turn to the defense. And what that means is America will continue to choose the pace and the placement of the battles. And all it's doing is it is trying to get islands that are close enough to use all those bombers to attack the Japanese mainland. Thus, in 1942, we're just starting in Europe. Really, in the Pacific, we've already achieved an advantage. And in 42, you've got we have made a partnership with both Britain and with Russia, but with Russia, they're screaming that they need somebody to attack on the mainland, and Stalin's demanding it. Churchill's totally opposed to it. What they will do is they will do a raid just to see how that works. And they will use 6,500 men, 6,000 of them are Canadians, and almost 60% are killed, wounded, or captured. We're looking to go on the offensive in Europe, but figuring out how is a bigger question. So instead, a more realistic goal is put forward, and to cut off the forces in Africa who are, of course, out there, capturing land, capturing oil supplies, and everything else. You have Operation Torch. We will project our power and have the first landings and the first battles first be against the French Vichy forces, not crack German troops. And of course, there is that belief that the French Vichy will throw up their hands, drop their weapons, and say, "So good to see you. We're really on the same side. We want to get away from these Germans." And of course, we've heard that before, and it does not happen that way. Operation Torch would cost the Allies about 480 killed, 720 wounded. French losses would be 3 times that in all cases. But it was an experience. But right after that, then we will end up fighting the Germans in some cases. And that will be a tremendous experience as well. We will join up with the British, who have already been fighting with Rommel. And we will lose a lot of tanks. We will prevail. And while still trying to figure out what's next, they will attack Italy, which will end up not working that well. And of course, in doing so, there they do find that the Italians really are tired of working with the Germans, that they do not like the way they're being treated. And in those cases, they might be willing to change their allegiances. But the German forces will stand up the Italians in front of them and fight a delaying action all the way up the boot. But, when the Germans had not been able to reduce London, through the blitzkrieg of the bombing campaign. The Allies would attempt to do the exact same thing back and bomb Germany into submission. Again, it doesn't work. It is successful against Germany, but it will not knock Germany out of the war. On the other hand, of course, it does cost 158,000 British, Canadian, and American aviators their lives. Remember, many thousands of the American B-17 crews passing through that war will come through Sioux City at the Army Air Base to learn their skills. And of course, this is one of the more famous ones, Jim Henry, who was educated to be a navigator, came from the canyons of New York City and would come back to Sioux City after the war. He's lucky he survived it. You know, you had to fly a certain number of missions because it was grueling and terrible. And the more you flew, the more likely you would make it. So I think it's 25 missions. And he had actually substituted on a different mission. So he'd hit his number and was able to step out. The 25th mission for the men that he had served the other 24 with, those men would go up and they would not return. He lost the entire crew that he had been with all along. And had he been on the plane, he too would have been lost. This is a picture of the bombers at the Sioux City Air Base. You know, what we come to find out is that America, the Allies, would have air superiority in these battles. And the difference is it was not because the American pilots were better or that their planes were better than anything else. It's actually just there are so many of them. The whole reason why Germany stopped the blitzkrieg against London was because they couldn't justify the losses of planes every night over and over again for the 8 months that they had done that. They realized they were just wasting their time. They were not going to make it work. So by 43, the decision comes down that the Allies will, and that means the Americans will invade Europe, and they have to. It's the only way they're going to meet their goal, because one of the other changes, remember, one of the big problems was that Germany had done their death ride and in World War I and had not been scratched, but they went, okay, we're done, and asked for an armistice. This time it is unconditional surrender. That is the only option to end this war. The Allies clearly have the upper hand, but that does not mean they're going to necessarily win. As the man picked to make that invasion, Dwight Eisenhower would say, we've got to go to Europe and fight. And that's because he had been selected by General George Marshall. FDR had put it to Marshall because Churchill expected and demanded George Marshall to be the person in charge. And FDR had said no, Marshall was his top military advisor and he could not spare him. The reality is, Marshall was not only his top military advisor, he was the one that made all of the supply and command issues that were necessary, the decisions necessary to prosecute a two-front war on two different halves of the globe. Marshall pushed Eisenhower to the head of the list, jumping him over all the other military in the chain of command, which of course ruffled feathers. Marshall didn't care. Ike would fly to London, receive his orders. You will enter the continent of Europe. You will undertake operations aimed at the heart of Germany and the destruction of her armed forces. That's a job description for you. And the interesting thing, of course, is Ike is a new kind of general. I said he had missed World War I because he was a trainer back in the US, training troops how to drive tanks, how to come up with successful tactics using those tanks. He had never led an army on the battlefield, but he had led the Africa, Sicily, and Italian invasions, and he had learned a lot. And one of those things he learned was you had to have overwhelming force. 6 a.m., the aircraft would pummel Normandy. Some people around our region, we knew it was big. I could see the ships and the pursuit planes below. That was Victor Schulten, Sheldon High School grad from Primgar, Iowa, remembering his 7-hour bombing run from June 6th. The warships had opened up at 5:30 and used all of their big guns to hit those same targets on the beach, trying to knock everything out. Gliders came over, depositing men and material there, and their paratroopers that would leap out of them into the mess. Young men like Jeff Younger, who was a radio operator, but from the Siouxland area, a Jeep driver. He's one of those men that went through this. Despite incredible losses, 60% of the men just being sent over in these paratroop and glider missions would be lost before they ever touched the ground. But they met their goals. Enemy phone and telegraph were completely disrupted. They would not be calling out to let the rest of the world know what was happening. And on June 6, 1944, the ships heading for Normandy, for that promised invasion of the mainland, came into view and started taking fire. Another man from out here, D.H. Mosman, 1939 Allen High School grad, who would be driving a bulldozer off one of those to punch a hole in the seawall. He said being out there was like being in the ocean in a damn dishpan to be in one of those LMCs. And as the men would stream out of there, when their gate opened, George Mills, PFC from Boyden, Iowa, landing at 900 at Omaha Beach. I just said a prayer. Things are happening so fast, you're just concentrating on staying alive. That was Frank Raymond and what was going through his mind when that landing craft gate opened at Omaha Beach. Raymond was with the 5th Rangers and he was from Little Sioux, Iowa. George Mills again from Boyden. I can see all the boys on the beach. I see a boy getting plasma. They say, don't stop, keep moving. It was hell. And as Harlan van Valkenburg would say, when the front gate of my landing craft opened, my life changed and has not been the same since. He was from Sioux City, Iowa, passed on a few years ago. Now, they would be successful, but it would be painful, but they did manage it. Omaha Beach was the worst, partially because the suppression fire was not as effective there. But following D-Day, the German army had kept the Allied forces tied up on the beaches and in the hedgerows for over a month. But the army would keep trying, and all of that would change when the Allied forces finally force a breakout with Operation Cobra. This is July 25th, so over a month later. But then things start to happen. July 26th, the Allies capture the French port of Cherbourg. The Germans are now in retreat. The breakout is beginning. By August 25th, the Allied troops liberate Paris after 4 years of German occupation. August 25th, in Paris, Iowa's citizen soldiers are the first to liberate Paris. Notably, that includes troopers from the 113th Cavalry Regiment, headquartered here in Sioux City. Iowa Guard units claim first in Paris. Damn it, Sarge, I'm looking up at Notre Dame. I know we're in Paris. That's just the Iowa Way. On January 26th of 42, elements of the 133rd Infantry Regiment from here in Sioux City with Sioux City troops were the first troops to reach Europe at all. In other words, to offload, in their case, in Italy, or excuse me, in Ireland, to prepare for all of this. And the 185th Field Artillery Battalion would fight its way through Italy in that invasion there. But getting back to the 113th, by September 5th, they had spearheaded so far into France that they did not have any combats to support them, any troops. And the main units at the time had no fuel to keep up. That was the big issue. By September 22nd, Patton's spectacular drive is halted, not by Germans, but by lack of fuel. It's the Red Ball Express that's brought in, the men driving trucks to bring gasoline to the front. And they would do so until November 16th, when Antwerp is finally opened so that they can ship it in directly. The Germans are reeling, but the US and Allied armies are outrunning their supply. This is the issue between Ike and the British field marshal for Montgomery. Ike wants a broad front so the men won't be trapped, which is the counterattacking that Germany is so good at. But Montgomery is saying, no, we're losing daylight. We're losing the chance to win this war. Here are some of those men of that Red Ball Express. Notice they're all black, aren't they? It's a segregated army at this point, and the men are being stationed in different work based on their color. It's another thing we don't think about, that even at this late date, that's happening. Montgomery says he could have won the war had they done it his way. Ike disagrees, and the broad front continues. But he finally gives in to Montgomery and allows him to plan that straight thrust. And this will be Operation Market Garden. We know it better as a bridge too far. It will be the largest drop of paratroopers in the war, and thus ever. It's the largest airborne assault in history. And it will capture 4 of the 5 bridges, and the tanks that are following up to relieve these men who have taken the bridges will fight their way tooth and nail to get there. But the men dropped at Arnhem are not able to capture that bridge intact. And more importantly, by doing so, the Rhine separates them. It is that natural bulwark for Germany. The efforts have to continue. They will finally take the port, but it will take time. And once the Germans are cleared from the river, now the supplies are coming through. Great. But what do we do next? Pushing forward with ready access to all these supplies, the broad front approach begins again. And in doing so, they come up against that thick Ardennes forest. The Ardennes, of course, is where the Germans had started all this in 1940, attacking through Belgium and on through the Ardennes to knock France out of the war. We, of course, see it as a thick forest. The Germans know that they've been through it before and can get there. We don't know that. There's only 4 divisions holding this area. It's a very thin line. Doesn't make any sense, though. We don't have to worry about it. It's not like the Germans are going to counterattack. Only a madman would do that. Well, that is one of the advantages of madness. Nobody saw it coming. The concept was insane. The Germans would be using troops that they needed to hold back to defend. But remember, this is where the German army had proven itself. The Prussians, actually, in the Franco-Prussian War, had used this area to defeat France to start with. Then again in 1940. Hitler's now amassed an army greater than the one he used in 1940. And his goal is to surprise and separate those Allied armies, the British from the Americans, to seize Antwerp again, to cut off the supplies, and then bargain for a separate peace. It really is Hitler's last gamble, partially because, he had had an assassination attempt on his life from his own generals. Hitler had not trusted his own command staff from that point on, and thus radio silence is complete, and that really works against the American intelligence because they hear nothing about this attack because Hitler doesn't trust his staff, not knowing that we've been listening in on all of their their encoded communications because of the Ultra Project. The entire German staff is misled, as are the Allies. And the American manpower shortages are starting to be felt. It takes time to get men from America over to Europe. And when 3 German armies plunge into the semi-mountainous, heavily forested region, around Bastogne, and a heavy artillery barrage pounds the American forward positions, followed by an onslaught and a breakthrough of armored columns, people are shocked, surprised, and can't figure out what's going on. Again, local voices. Art Dunshee from Clarinda, Iowa. At the time of Bulge, we'd been online for about 6 months without a break. Each squad was covering an area that a company would have. So, in other words, 5 to 10 men where 50 would have been covering it. And with the snow and the bitter cold, it is a terrible place to find yourself in battle. All hell broke loose, recalled Harold Rathert. It was mass pandemonium. Rathert is from Des Moines, Iowa, and part of the 9th Infantry Division. We hear news back. The Germans are striking back at the 7th Army invasion. Nobody is really putting together that this is really an attack. And part of that is because heavy cloud cover, total bad weather had neutralized the Allied air superiority. They couldn't see anything. They had no eyes and they had no intelligence that they could derive from it. It would continue for almost a week. And in doing so, Bradley and Ike will disagree on the importance of these attacks. It's a spoiling attack, says General Bradley. No importance at all. Ike ponders it and says it felt like something more. Rather would say we had a lot of artillery shellings. We went through strafings many, many times. Every day was an adventure. That's what it was like for these men on that front line facing off against the full might of, 3 German armies. The panzers had overwhelmed the overmatched Americans. They were on their way to the Meuse River. They were on their way to meet that goal that Hitler had set. John Phillips of Waterloo was ordered forward within moments. 2 friends were dead and another wounded, and Phillips himself had 3 rounds in his stomach. The shot that would have hit his heart is stopped by a Bible. You can actually see that in the Waterloo Museum for World War II. Now, like many others in this battle, the war is over for him. He will survive a POW camp, however. The reports are continuing to come in from the front lines that are overwhelmed, and the more Ike is certain it's now an actual attack, but his question is, what do I do about it? Is he short on manpower? He had that broad front, but that means that he had put everybody on the line. He had no real reserve. No one had expected a counterattack because it would be short-lived. On the other hand, General George Patton, the Third Army, Ike's buddy, would say we could still lose this war. The fighting is intense and brutal, and it would turn out to be one of the coldest winters in Europe in the 20th century. And in the process, you would also have the situation where the Germans, who really don't have time and don't have excess resources themselves, will decline to take prisoners. And they will, after receiving the surrender of 84 Americans, will execute them at the crossroads. This, of course, will backfire on them, and it will strengthen the resolve of all the men that are there. By December 26th, after one of the worst Christmases that the American army had faced since really Valley Forge, Patton's Third Army will reach Bastogne. They will lift the siege. There will continue to be heavy fighting, but they almost bag the entire German forces. Some will say that it was Montgomery that let them escape. Not everybody. It's the weather that rescues the German army as heavy snows come up and delay the advance, and they allow the Germans to get out of the closing trap. But the big thing is, even doing so, the Germans cannot bring back a destroyed army. They cannot bring back tanks that have been destroyed, planes that have been lost, nor can they retreat dead men or prisoners. It is a costly loss for the Germans, and it will change the war going forward. Germans suffered as many as 200,000 casualties. Of those, 110,000 were captured men, men that will not be available when the defense of the actual German homeland comes soon. They also lost 1,400 tanks. These are high quality tanks that were needed in defense on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, who are plowing forward, not here. This is the equivalent of Hitler's version of that death ride that ended World War I. It's going out with a bang. Churchill would be the first to say that undoubtedly this is America's greatest battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever famous American victory. We're talking about the Battle of the Bulge. Others know it as the Battle of the Ardennes Forest, but Churchill is not wrong. It is, but it's also the second most deadly series of battles in American history. 8,000 men are dead, 48,000 are wounded, 21,000 are prisoners or missing. Now, what that really means is our losses are far less than the Germans, but they're still painful. Some 20,000 injuries are just due to cold. Harold Rather would survive the battle, but almost lost his feet to frostbite. But as a esteemed historian would say, Hitler had sacrificed his last reserves and best armor on essentially a doomed enterprise. Failure of the Ardennes offensive represents that last gasp of the Third Reich. And with that, the war would continue on for another 6 months. But with all that, we see the war winding down. It is clearly won. Now, with that, we now have also come within range where long range bombers are going to be able to nightly wreak havoc on Japan. And that's going to end that war as well. We just don't know it yet, and we're going to see how that plays out. But I want you just to realize, why was the war in the Pacific so much different than the war in Europe? The objectives, for one. This was a war that was designed to fight over small pieces of land that seemed to have very little value and no way off it. So the Japanese would dig in and die to the last man. The type of warfare, thus, is much more brutal, much more in your face, absolutely at times hand-to-hand combat. The technology differences are so great. The Americans, with their long range guns and everything else, a lot of times the Japanese are fighting with smaller, lesser pieces of equipment and really have to get up close to do damage. Bigger issues are the cultural differences. The Japanese consider themselves a superior race, and have absolutely no interest. Anybody that would surrender, why would we bother to keep them alive? One of the things that happens very early on is you come to realize that in the Pacific theater, it is a race war. And that, pure and simple, is it, because no quarter will be um, the standard. No quarter meaning you don't take prisoners, you do not allow anything like that to happen, because the things that will happen is, in taking those prisoners, you will find you were baited and you will have an ambush. um, and on the other hand, if the Americans are to surrender, at the very best, they may or may not. They will have a very unpleasant and brutal POW experience if they get that far. It's very possible they will just be killed outright. So as the war is winding down, the question is what follows it. The conflicting goals now become apparent. That was one of the reasons Hitler tried what he tried. He could never understand. He's got a monarchy, a democracy, and a communist dictator facing him. How can all three of these agree? He thought if he could isolate each one and batter them, that they would drop out. It does not work that way. Wilson's ideal of self-determination past the war is only given lip service. Reality this time is prevailing. Now, by 45, it's clear that war would be won, and now is the time for planning. Churchill wanted to make sure he had free and fair elections in all of these areas that are now occupied by the Soviets. Remember, it was the conquering of Poland that would start this, and really the Soviets had a part in that. So this is really tough, and Stalin wants governments who are loyal and friendly to the Soviet Union to act as a buffer zone against the next time the Germans rise up and attack. So all of these issues are being determined, promises are given, but not necessarily meant to be kept in the case of Stalin. But very shortly thereafter, the men who had seen the results of a botched ending of World War I are now leaving the stage. FDR is gone. Soon Churchill would be voted out of office by a grateful England. Stalin's control is complete and dictatorial. Only death is going to remove him. But in the short term, the news is good. Hitler will die. Unconditional surrender is proclaimed, and our troops on Okinawa will take control and thus allow the bombings. Potsdam will follow, where we're deciding the path forward, yet, it's history that decides the moves. Really, Churchill and Stalin are demanding reparations. Truman, an avid member, reader of history, is keenly aware that it's the economic punishment inflicted on the Germans after World War I that led to Adolf Hitler. And with that, he's determined not to make the same mistake. Truman is also, after the very first events, is very suspicious of the Soviets. He does not trust Stalin, and we'll get there. We'll get to the point even where it's even worse. But remember, though, do the Soviets have a right for any demands? Of the 50 million deaths in World War II, the USSR paid almost half that bill. They will tend to think they have a lasting impact. And they are the ones who will take Berlin. But at the same time, it is now post-war, because the A bomb is dropped, and the second A bomb will be dropped when the Japanese do not surrender immediately. And with that, we have turned a page to an atomic era. The war is concluded. The balance of power has changed. Germany, Japan, Italy, as well as France have all dropped off the great power status. Britain is teetering, and thus we have a change from a multipolar world to a bipolar. You are either with the Americans or with the Soviets. And what has really happened is this means the removal of all constraints on any Soviet expansion. Britain can't stand up to them. For that matter, neither could we without the bomb. And in all this, the US now has become the mainstay of capitalism, having replaced Great Britain on that. So, what we see in a post 1945, influence becomes important. The loss of all the colonies means a growth of third world, people that are not aligned with either one. You have a jousting for open markets versus closed systems, i.e., freedom and capitalism versus control and socialism. Truman, of course, like everybody else, wants to draw back. He's sick of babying the Soviets. He's already rejected another Allied Lend-Lease extension. 40 billion is enough. The truth is, it wasn't. But the parting of the ways comes quickly. Before the Communist Party Congress, Stalin suggests that communism and capitalism are totally incompatible. He pledges himself to a world revolution of the proletariat. Proletariat, the grassroots working people of the world. Stalin's speech denouncing all the Western leaders has a major impact in the changes going forward. As we reach this post-war era, what we will see is a shift where it now becomes West versus East and primarily US versus Soviet. The Iron Curtain speech. At first, a lonely voice, Churchill, who is trying to draw attention to the differences in what the Soviets say and what they're actually doing and what's happening. He gives a speech by invitation from Truman at a small little college in Fulton, Missouri, mainly because none of the big places wanted to see him. Churchill's old news. And he keeps going on about these Soviets. War's over. What do we care? But in that speech in Fulton, Churchill famously declares an iron curtain is descending across Europe, meaning that we cannot see what is happening, what the Soviets are doing, what's happening behind the lines. And everybody is aware of the horrors they found in that same situation when they could not see what was happening in all those camps that the Nazis were stocking with people. But remember, it's January of 47. The Europeans are at the end of their rope. There is nothing left. It has been bombed, blasted, run over by opposing armies, blown up, burned out. If by some miracle a factory had survived, there's no raw materials left to produce anything. And even if there was, there's no railroad to bring the ore to the factory or the manufactured goods to market. And you are facing the beginning of a terrible winter. Month after month of below zero temps and record breaking snowfall. That's in Europe. Britain is no better. More importantly, by the winter of 47, the people had consumed all the food available. They had not been able to plant and grow a crop. Into this area steps men who are determined to see a different outcome than what we saw at the end of World War I. And it's a global note. And in doing so, Truman too becomes one of those people. As I said, an avid historian, and with Atchison providing him with backgrounds and thoughts, you're coming up with the idea that Truman will discuss the situation of the coming winter in Europe. And Truman says, we really have to have two things happen. We have to have a Truman doctrine because the British are stepping back. They have no money left. And that Truman doctrine will be back, which is to say we will contain the Soviets. They can be where they are and go no further. But we will combine that with the Marshall Plan, which will provide Europe with the ability to survive. And in fact, initially they offer it to the Soviets. The Soviets sense it's a trap and refuse it. Taft replies, I think we can support this. It's going to take a lot of money. You're going to need to scare the hell out of the American public to get this. And thus, as 47, Truman changes the War Department to the Department of Defense. He will make George Marshall his Secretary of State. He will declare the Truman Doctrine of containment in opposition to communists. And the European Recovery Act, proposed by George Marshall, later to be known as the Marshall Plan, is pushed out, and Congress will support it. General George Marshall, in the view of Truman, is probably the greatest American who ever lived. He might be right, at least one of the most capable. As I said, Truman offers the Truman Doctrine, containment of the Soviets, March 1947. The Marshall Plan arrives in June of 1947, and all of the aid that will be given to the Europeans is in grants, not loans, and it's $13 billion. With that, the American general public, torn by strikes in the US and seeing the rise of communism sweeping Europe and remembering what happened after World War II, goes along. Europe, still battered by the effects of the war and facing a winter of starvation, joins in. George Marshall announces the European Recovery Plan is to provide goods as well as dollars to rebuild Europe. Of course, the goal is to stave off the appeal of communism. The idea that all of Europe could possibly have shifted to a communist-centered organization was not an outlandish thought. And especially with Stalin creating a political group in Eastern Europe as propaganda, and with looters in the streets of Rome, hunger riots elsewhere, warfare in Greece and Albania, something has to be done. And into that something steps America. Immediately, you'll have the first crisis, because when we partitioned everything, Berlin was also partitioned. So there are allies in Berlin, but that is deep in the heart of the Eastern partition that the Soviets control. And on June 24th, 48, they decide they're going to starve out the Allies in West Berlin. They close all the roads, and the Allies flew 200,000 flights in 1 year, providing up to 4,700 tons of necessities such as food and fuel to the Berliners. All of this then makes it clear there has to be an offset to the Soviets. And what will happen is one of the most major changes in American history. This country that has always said we will have no dangling commitments, and definitely not in Europe, will come up with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And there are three parts to this. The number one part, keep the Soviets out of Europe. The number two part is to keep the Americans in Europe and engaged, and to keep Germany down is the third part, thus the partitioning of it. At the same time, the state of Israel is born, and Truman immediately recognizes it. Truman sends a Civil Rights Act to Congress. Unheard of. You still have the Southern Democrats really in control. And when Congress fails to pass it, he will sign an executive order to desegregate the military. Unbelievable. But he does it, and it works. With this change, by April 4th, 1949, NATO exists. And it is Truman that has made this possible, with George Marshall, Dean Acheson, and many others. And the interesting aspect of this is, let me get through some of this to wrap this up. You have to question, Was it a success or failure? Truman created a consensus for America's change to internationalism. In doing so, where it had taken Europe 7 years to crawl out from under the destruction of World War I with far greater damage, they're back in less than 5 years. With the Marshall Plan, had helped Europe climb back to above 20% of the post-war level. And they did not have any countries fall to dictatorships or to communism. In doing so, he did it that those millions and billions spent, a great amount of that was spent buying America's goods to provide the Europeans with the things they needed. They prevented a post-war crash that, like the one that had brought on the Great Depression. And it creates a goodwill that will last for over 50 years. And it's aid, not guns. It's food, it's bread, it's the basics. Truman ends up right on containment. You could not have rolled them back without the use of nuclear weapons. He was right on civil rights, even though he was pillared for it at the time. He was right on the Marshall Plan, even though it cost a lot of money. But as he would definitely say, it's far cheaper than another war, which is what we would have had. And he's right on the Truman Doctrine to contain the Soviets until they cannot continue. He wasn't alone. He had people supporting him. But the biggest interesting thing is all the people that followed him will follow the same course, even though in their campaigns they may say exactly the opposite. They move from right to left. Kennedy would follow that course. Johnson, of course, would follow that course. Nixon would follow that. And, really, these are men who had experienced warfare. Johnson, not so much. He'd actually made it sound like he did, but he stayed in Congress, really. But an entire generation is shaped by World War II, just as they had been shaped by World War I. And they were men who had known what had happened in the failure of World War I to be resolved. They were not going to see that happen in their case. And of course, another one, who's this guy? George Herbert Walker Bush, who served as a fighter pilot, was actually shot down in the Pacific. All of these men, to some degree, and many of them to a great degree, would, oppose the Soviet Union. Of course, the most famous of that group, is this guy who would demand that we tear the wall down. What did we get for all that? Well, I want you to think about the backing we got from our global partners. They followed us into Korea. For good or for bad, they followed us into Vietnam. They back our plays. They would back us more than once in Iraq. And under President George H.W. Bush, Desert Storm Coalition was 35-nation military alliance formed in 1990 to liberate an invaded Kuwait. That coalition was assembled under the authority of the United Nations, but it was led by the United States. It was doing what we wanted done. And the men who followed those first five that we saw into office would also follow this. We had the technology. We embraced nuclear energy, aerospace, electronics. All of these things moved forward. All of these things were part of that American century as we created all of these different things to make a country that was totally different. You got to remember, following World War II, American education experienced an era of unprecedented growth, increased enrollment never seen before that. It's accompanied by efforts to expand access and improve curriculum. Missed in all of our arguments today about how bad education is, we forget that we educate everyone, not just the elite. It makes a difference when you're compiling all of the numbers. But Going back to what grew out of World War II was that dramatic redistribution of income through society. We gave generous veterans benefits, which contributed to that transformation of everyday life in America. The GI Bill enabled veterans to gain low cost education and to gain mortgages for home ownership. Congress passed it unanimously. It dramatically increased the number of Americans graduating from college every year from 160,000 graduates in the 1930s to 500,000 per year by 1950. And remember, they didn't stop there. 45, you had the GI Bill. 66, you had the creation of trade schools. 2000, you have high school trade school support. When I gave this at noon, we were standing in the building of one of those original schools out of 66. And of course, you look at this is a community high school for the construction trade. We hear all the time, well, you can just go into the trades, but we have to have somebody to teach. We are doing it. It's really those who aren't paying attention that are constantly claiming we're not. And here's my other thing. Do you think we're not wealthy? This is a high school facility. And that cost is dissipated through the federal government. You think we're not wealthy? 1955, we create Disneyland, a child centered marketing ploy, that becomes world famous. We have the rise of Las Vegas. It speaks to the amount of surplus money that was generated by post-war American economy. And don't think that's gone. Our citizens' mobility increased because of automobiles, and then we created the interstate system, which also increased our ability to market, deliver goods, and everything else. So, what is the American century? It's an era where the United States has been largely dominant in political, meaning getting the rest of the world to do what we want. In the economic area, money. In technology, and you look at the growth in technological issues, putting men on the moon, all of the rest of it. And in our cultural terms, and we need to think about that. One of the things that everybody wants is our culture. Now, you might consider the fact that we have domestic luxury compared to many countries. But really, it's also that sense of almost boundless, technologically enhanced possibilities for our future. But more than that, our cultural terms and the concept that we believe and embrace in education for all. All of those pieces. And think about this, who is sending their kids to America? It's all those who don't live here. Our colleges are the envy of the world. So, what defines the American century? I guess I want you to think about that. If this were Jeopardy, I would be saying, what is freedom? What is power? Is it only wealth? I say no. You know, it's connected. The fact that everybody wants what we have means that they're willing to accept our rules, including our financial directions, mainly as long as the dollar is the standard for all currencies, we're good. Of course, today we've been seeing a lot of slip on that because the other thing we're doing is we aren't embracing our culture. You know, the world wishes they had the individual houses, the access to cars, to roads, to education, not just the elite, but everybody. The ability to work your way up with fewer class barriers. They all envy our obvious freedoms. And that is that example. We have just checked all the boxes that I said are the important pieces for what defines an American century, an era where the United States is largely dominant in political, economic, technological, and cultural terms. And we came to that by our choices at the end of World War II, by our effort not to have the same situation unfold that had happened at the end of World War I, where we walked away. And I guess I will just posit this thought. We spent just as I talked about with Truman, Truman was very cognizant of the fact that it was going to cost a lot of money to do the Marshall Plan. And his point was fighting a war would be much more costly. I want you to think about the fact we fought a Cold War to a point where the Soviet Union fell apart. And at the end of that war, did we do anything similar to a Marshall Plan to make certain that all of those countries who stepped up and stepped out and stepped away from the USSR to embrace the idea of democracy, did we do anything to help make sure that their experience 10 and 15 years after that fall would not be a return to dictatorship, would not be a return to strongman governments, would not be a return to everything we did not want to see. And if you look at our gross national product at the end of World War II and at the end of the Soviet Union, there is absolutely no reason we couldn't have done that if we had had the far-ranging thinkers in place that we had throughout that period after World War I, through the Great Depression, and into World War II. It takes leadership. It takes people looking forward. It takes a goal of having a good outcome, not just for your people, but for all people. And with that, I have reached overdue, I know, the end of my talk. I'm sorry that I took extra time, but I wanted to hammer all those points in. I hope this was a conversation you were looking for when you started this. And I really, really appreciate all of you hanging with me through this. So thank you. I'm going to unmute everybody. And with that, I guess you'll have to click it to unmute is the way it works. I thought I could unmute that myself. Shucks. So there you are. If you have any questions or any thoughts, feel free to share them. But otherwise, folks, thank you so much for being here. And I hope those of you who are taking part in everything out on the trip are having a great time. So, and Mary Jo writes, thanks, Russ, an excellent series that I really enjoyed. My dad was shot on 2/6/45 while on guard duty following the bulge. He laid in the snow and played dead, held his breath when a German shoulder kicked him until the Germans left the area and he could get to an aid station. He never talked about it. And that is exactly so true. Never talked about his World War II experiences much, but after he died in 98, we found a written account. He was from Odo, Iowa, longtime elementary principal in the Sioux City school system, and thanked his education via the GI Bill. Thank you so much for sharing that. You know, when I went out and got all those other quotes over the years, almost all of those folks are gone now too. And that is a tough time. And I'm so sorry we've lost their voices. Thanks. This was excellent, says Mary Anderson. Much to think about. Very informative. Thank you. I really appreciate all of you sticking through all this. I hope you feel it was worth your time. And I hope you all have a great night. We'll be talking about what happens next week. You may get a note that says, I don't see any reason not to do the Zoom. I might have some problems being back in town in time to do next week's program. If so, it would be the first time I'd missed a class in all of these 20 plus years. So I'm fighting that, but I think we may have to do that. I leave tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock to go to New York, and there's things that are happening there that I just can't get around. So thank you all. I really appreciate you being here tonight, and I hope you have a great night. I hope it was a worthwhile use of your time.
I had an uncle that was a photographer for the army, and he brought some back that you have only heard about, like the piles of bodies at the concentration camps.
Yeah.
So he saw a lot of things I'm sure he wish he could forget.
Yes, I'm sure.
My dad was in World War II, came back a broken man. And I
Wow.
remember when they reunited Germany, my mother was Scandinavian and married to a German, was really, really upset that they should never have allowed that. And then I also want to just say to you that when you sneezed, I wanted to say Gesundheit, but I didn't dare.
That was a great one. Thank you so much. Oh boy.
All right. Well,
Well,
thank you.
thank you, folks. Wonderful to have you here. And I appreciate your support so much. You have a great night. Be safe in all you do. And remember to tell the people you love that you love them, because you don't always get that chance.
Yeah.
So you take care, folks. Have a good night, and I will see you next time.
Good night.
Good night.